We now have the second part of Dr. Anandita Pan's workshop on intersectionality and standpoint theory and gender justice. So I welcome Dr. Pan, please.
Sure. Okay. So now in the first talk, it was more of a theoretical thing. Although we did talk about two cases, and I thought in this talk we'll talk about some of the texts. And I've already shared, a couple of texts with you. So whenever you get time, please watch it. Now, I wanted to begin by, begin this talk by drawing from the earlier talk where we ended on the Bhanwari Devi rape case and the erasure of Dalit women. So on this question, I specifically wanted to focus the question of gender and justice onto the ideas of voice and agency. And the first text that I'd like to begin with is Writing with Fire. Now, why do I begin with Writing with Fire, and how does it become very relevant to the question of justice? Now, to understand it, I would like to link it with the hashtag #MeToo movement, which became absolutely instrumental, I would say, in contemporary feminist thought and feminist movement and activism, right? So it's also called as, the hashtag #MeToo movement as bringing about a new era in feminism, Indian feminism specifically. And the hashtag #MeToo movement in India claims inheritance of previous movements such as the 2009 Pink Chutney movement, which was against moral policing, the 2011 Slut Walk movement against victim blaming, the 2015 Pinjra Tod movement against curfew in hostels, and the 2017 movement titled Bekhauf Azadi. Now, all these movements from which the hashtag #MeToo actually claims heredity are movements proclaiming women's rights to access public space. In other words, if we go back to the 19th and early 20th century conversations relating to gender, a lot of it was focused on the public-private boundary. And the hashtag #MeToo movement, to an extent, brought this whole, scenario once again out in terms of who can really speak up for themselves. The questions, however, remained in the end, and actually, with the help of social media, smartphones, the reach in terms of speaking about oneself, voicing one's opinion, even sharing one's, experiences of victimization became really a moment to gain solidarity across, if not India, across the globe actually. But the questions, however, remain: whose storytelling is more visible? Does identity in terms of caste, class, and gender play a role in determining subjecthood in the hashtag #MeToo movement? How do we confront the issues of who speaks for whom, going back to the previous article? And is solidarity achieved by acknowledging difference or by erasing it, right? We are talking about homogeneity. Now, in its focus on gender inequality and sexual violence, the #MeToo movement, it has been claimed, ironically reproduces casteist, classist, and sexist hierarchies. What seems to drive the movement in India is the anxiety regarding women's confinement in the domestic sphere and the resultant inability to speak. Consequently, what underlies the movement are the desire to be visible in the public sphere and make the voices heard. Now, this understanding is also, predicated on the idea of that women do have access to social media or even the English language. So, Jenny Rowena argues that we need to look into the nature of sexual harassment discourse itself to bring out the ways in which it has always tilted towards the interests of elite upper caste women. Now, the identification of differences or the lack thereof is raised by Dalit feminists such as Sharmila Rege and Jenny Rowena. Dalit feminism articulates difference from mainstream Indian feminism and Dalit politics, and this is where I look at Dalit women as a category in contradistinction to mainstream Indian woman and Dalit man. Dalit politics through the invocation of intersection between caste and gender. Dalit feminism claims that the interventionist approaches, such as mainstream Indian feminism and Dalit politics, fail to address issues concerning Dalit women because they see caste and gender as two separate and mutually exclusive categories. Dalit feminism, on the other hand, sees caste and gender as two interrelated structures that actively and simultaneously contribute to the structural oppression of Dalit women. The complexity of digital access is addressed in the documentary Writing with Fire, which was released in 2021. Now, in the documentary, we actually see I have presented some scenes here so that it will be easy for you to understand. In the documentary, we see Dalit women journalists of Khabar Lahariya making a transformation in news reporting through the introduction of digital platforms. Now, in this slide, we see the fact that they are journalists is in itself a very unbelievable sort of situation. With the one journalist, her husband speaking that I never expected them to achieve anything at all, and she goes on to say how her work comes at a great personal risk, and whenever she goes to seek accommodation in urban areas or areas that are not dominated by Dalits alone, the first question is about her caste. Now, Writing with Fire is important for many reasons, but here I will specifically focus on the idea of digital access and connect it with the Me Too movement. So now the transformation of or the introduction to digital media comes with new challenges. We hear journalist Shamkali's voice echoing through many as she expresses her fear of touching and potentially destroying the smartphone. Her fear reflects the masculinization of science and digital modes of communication, added to the patriarchal perception of women as inherently incapable of having intelligence. The digital divide is broadened further through the inaccessibility of English language. While on the one hand, the documentary shows the tremendous scope of the digital platform in reaching a global audience and making journalism a true praxis of the people, by the people, and for the people, it also creates unique obstacles for Dalit women journalists. Sunita, another journalist, mentions the numerous prank calls she receives since her presence in the Khabar Lahariya YouTube channel. The comment section in YouTube reveals blatant caste sexist attacks on Dalit women journalists. The detrimental impact of social media is also visible in the way the youth of the nation consumes information. In fact, Writing with Fire shows how dominant politics, armed with religious sentiments, utilizes the social media to promote and strengthen specific ideologies. Oh, sorry. So, in such scenario, Dalit women can be seen as occupying an extremely marginalized position. Shyamkali's lack of knowledge in English reveals how Savarna women are the beneficiaries of the Brahminical knowledge and power structure of the Indian academic space, as they have established parallel space for feminist research and development. Dalit women, on the other hand, find themselves outside the framework of these feminist discourses. It is for this reason that the sole focus on the sexual harassment in Me Too movement fails to address the reality of intersectional oppression on Dalit women. And in this context, I would like to reiterate, one reference to the Unlimited Girls, one documentary by Paromita Vora. I think it's perhaps one of the first documentaries which, explored chat room as a space wherein the anonymous identities create a scope for agency and voice for the women. So there's a character called Fearless who goes on a journey to explore whether she is a feminist or not, because there's a chat room, very interestingly, which is um, termed as All We Need to Know About Love, or All We Need is Love, actually. And some presume that this is a dating website, but it's actually a chat room where different women come together and discuss feminism. And that can be considered as one of the beginning sort of spaces where we can see chat rooms as coming with presenting immense possibility and potential. But this same cannot be seen in case of Writing with Fire. Now, According to Radhika Gajala, we often associate voice as an empowering moment that is tangible, as direct speech which is unmediated by power hierarchies coming from a corporeal body on the other end of the gadget or computer. Such correlations, however, are often too simplistic. As we see in case of Dalit women journalists in Khabar Lahariya, the organization which is covered in this documentary, uh, a physical manifestation of voice does not ensure agency. It needs to be recognized in a more nuanced manner in the form of negotiation. Gajala mentions that in order to assess voices in its multiple formats, we need to ask new questions. Do the affordances of the gadget or platform for engaging the digital provide access, misinformation, or surveillance? Under what conditions is access liberating and empowering? Such questions highlight both the construction of such voice and the politics behind it. Now, the documentary is also very interesting because it presents the complexity of allyship in Dalit feminism. In the Indian context, women as middle class and upper caste has a long genealogy that historically and conceptually goes back to the nationalism as well as social reform. We only need to take a look at the character of or the figure of the Bhadra Mahila. The erasure of caste in feminism and gender in Dalit politics has given rise to the phenomenon that all women are upper caste and all lower castes are men. In this context, women's role in the anti-mandal agitation is significant. And I'd like to give an example or maybe an instance. So, the agitation was caused by the government's decision to implement the suggestions of the Mandal Commission, wherein a quota would be implemented for the OBCs and would be used in recruitment to the public and central services. Now, as a response to the policy, women college students in Delhi demonstrated on the street with placards reading, "We don't want unemployed husbands." Now, Uma Chakravarti actually argues that the implication of the placard was rooted in Brahminical patriarchal ideologies. She says, what the placards were saying was that these girls would be deprived of upper caste IAS husbands. But what they were also saying was that the OBCs and Dalits who would now occupy these positions in the IAS could never be their potential husbands. Suji Tharu and Tejaswini Niranjana show how the late 20th century, anti-mandal woman aligns herself above all as a citizen of India rather than as a gendered being, thus avoiding a battle of sexes with middle-class men. However, this claiming of citizenship rather than sisterhood with Dalit women now not only set them against Dalit men, but also against lower caste, lower class women. So, a reorienting of caste gender question through an intersectional lens reveals that women's bodies are marked by Brahminical tropes of sexual control, which were established through the Vedic dominance. Women emerge not only as a heterogeneous category, it also becomes imperative to recognize the specificity of their concerns as impacted by different systems. Now, in this context, I would like to, highlight one of the debates that surrounded the Pijrator movement as well. So, the Pijrator movement became, one of the very important moments where women really came together and talked about sexism, talks against sexism. But there was an instance when within the Pijrator group, there were criticisms that it is not providing adequate space for Dalit girls to speak out. In terms of issues, they chose to speak on different sorts of matters, and Pijrator can be seen as open to exploring gender through its intersections and with other structures of oppression. Now, in response to the criticism, they mentioned that they are actually invested in a host of issues faced by women on campus, and as such allegations were baseless, and they were actually quite accommodative of other factors as well. Now, interestingly, they argue that their point of contention was never premised on intersectionality per se, which is very interesting. Their attention to plural forms of discrimination seems to have emerged in the process of the various campus related issues they focused on. Such proclamation almost dismisses the necessity of keeping intersectionality at the center. A Dalit feminist approach, for example, to the Me Too movement, would address this specific necessity. It shows that the understanding of sexual harassment as solely a result of gender oppression will only reproduce the caste blind discourse and invisibilize Dalit women and their experiences. So, the Me Too movement, in claiming justice, solidarity, and agency, not only ignores the fact of accessibility to digital platforms, it also represents gender in a singular homogeneous term. And what is more interesting is that if we look at Writing with Fire, it has been praised as one of the rare documentaries that gives space to the voices of Dalit women journalists. But by the end of it, we see one of the very prominent journalists actually decides to leave and get married, and that is considered to be a form of betrayal by her fellow journalists as well. On that note, then, this is how I thought of connecting it with Ramulama's stories also, because there also we find detective who is a Dalit woman. Now, why talk about detective fiction? Okay, and the reason why I chose detective fiction is that the question of justice becomes very crucial when we think about the art of detection. Okay, so, at its core, detective fiction is built around the concept of justice, which typically manifests in the resolution of a crime through rational investigation. The figure of the detective embodies logic, order, and often an idealized form of morality. Whether it is Sherlock Holmes with his methodical deductions or Hercule Poirot with his psychological acuity, the detective's role is to restore balance by identifying the perpetrator of a crime, typically murder. The notion of justice in detective fiction often reflects social values, but it can also challenge them. In classical or classic detective stories, justice is equated with law enforcement, aligning moral correctness with legal authority. However, in more contemporary renditions, justice is depicted as a more complex and morally ambiguous concept, and detectives may question the legal system's ability to deliver justice. So here are some of the traditional elements of detective story. Now, detective fiction, which is a genre defined by investigation, mystery, resolution, has been a significant literary form for examining justice and social order. But this genre is also a rich site for gender analysis, where notions of masculinity, femininity, and power are reinforced and subverted. Exploring the intersection of detective fiction, justice, and gender unveils how the genre grapples with social norms and offers insights into broader discourses of gendered and other forms of power dynamics. Let's begin with a quick look, very brief look, at Arthur Conan Doyle's story, The Adventures of a Solitary Cyclist. So, the reason why I begin with this is to highlight the figure of the detective also. So, in April 1895, Holmes is contacted by a beautiful young music teacher. I am reproducing the words as it is. A beautiful young music teacher named Violet Smith, who lives near Surrey, and she is worried about a stranger who is stalking her when she is bicycling to and from the train station where she goes to see her fiance in London each weekend. Now, it is interesting to note that the case, that Miss Violet initially presented to Sherlock Holmes is actually stalking from a stranger cyclist. But it functions as a red herring in the story. So, a red herring misleads or distracts from a relevant or essential question. So, in the story, this case of stalking is not at all treated seriously when the story ends. The detective makes us believe that although the strange cyclist who stalks Violet Smith seems to be a criminal, he is actually not. In the story, stalking is actually presented as an expression of love and concern about protection. So, we are back to the very interesting protectionist discourse. The only crime that is treated as a crime, in fact, is Violet Smith's abduction by Woodley and Williamson, two other characters. And the crime of stalking is very conveniently brushed off. So the reason why Williamson and Woodley, are considered to be criminals is also because they belong to the lower rung of the society and are already treated as subjects who have flouted the social norms. On the other hand, the person, Carothers, who was stalking her, is actually her employer and is quite rich. So, in fact, Sherlock sympathizes with the aristocratic Carothers. We also see Ralph, the illiterate uncle of Violet Smith, who is a menial worker in South Africa, who also gets punished for another crime. So, the people who get punished are usually from the lower classes, and the victim of the crime is also someone from the lower class. Now detective stories follow similar sorts of method in the Indian context as well. In fact, as we know, detective stories ranging from Bomkesh or other people depended or borrowed heavily from the figure of Sherlock Holmes. Now, on this note, I know although I gave you the story of Ramulamma, I wanted to compare the story with another story called A Face in the Crowd, and I'll give you the summary of it. So, A Face in the Crowd is a story from the collection of stories Murder in Seven Acts by Kalpana Swaminathan. And the major character of this story, or the detective here, is Lali. And Lali is an established detective. And this specific story follows the experiences of Auntie May, who is an elderly woman who lives alone, and she claims to have seen one face repeatedly in the crowd, and she is very concerned about it. So Lali and her niece Sita are called to solve the crime, and gradually what they realize is she was basically getting stalked and also getting harmed by another past competitor, and this is talking about a love interest called Gracie. And it speaks about Gracie's return and ultimate revelation of the crime. So it features the detective Lali as she works her way through seven cases. The book has seven stories and seven cases. Each of these are different and all of them are mysterious. And Sita is Lali's niece, who is the narrator, guiding the reader through it all. Now, as for the mysteries, they appear baffling, and only Lali has the ability to piece together the seemingly random clues. The Lali mysteries are one of the most notable sets of detective stories in contemporary times that focus on a female detective. As I've mentioned earlier, the detective fiction has four major elements: observation, deduction through evidence, mind boggling wits, and objectivity. Now, enter Lali, a female detective who seemingly fits the role. She is perceptive and almost clinically so. The story builds her credibility by proving or providing an elaborate picture of her past successful cases. It also highlights her training, which adds to her credibility. She is detached from the subject of her analysis. She is neutral and seemingly she sees the whole picture, kind of an omniscient, omnipotent narrator. Sita, on the other hand, is unable to match up to her aunt. Now, if we compare them, Lali is Holmes and Sita is basically Watson. Sita is much more involved. She does not have the distance that is required to achieve objectivity. She does not have the experience either to solve mysteries. Lali is, on the other hand, is a curious person. It's written in the story that she collects cases. It is mere curiosity to her. Her credibility, it shows that she is a professional detective. Now, in the middle of the Auntie May's the case, which is presented by Auntie May, Lali has to rush to take care of a Jalna matter, another case. She also dehumanizes subjects just like Holmes does and is very dispassionate. If we take a look at the first quotation here, that she stirred the bones with a pencil. This presents a very dispassionate picture of how Lali is going on and describing the evidences that she comes across, and it also establishes her knowledge in anatomy. She employs tools like photography, newspaper, both of which are known for their ability to replicate reality with minimal alteration or mediation. These mediums are often seen as direct reflections of the world, capturing events and moments as they are. Her approach is meticulous. She does not rely on chance or assumptions. Instead, She thoroughly examines every document, carefully tracing relevant connections and ensuring that no detail is overlooked. And by doing so, she ensures that her work is grounded in verifiable facts, leaving no room for ambiguity. Now, what is the genesis of this whole mystery story here? Whether Auntie May has really seen the mysterious face or whether she is hallucinating, and this is another age related problem. Now, to know this, first we need to, see how we are introduced to Auntie May. And hers is a family of NRIs who are unable to properly care for her. And you can see how the story begins in the second quotation that is provided. So, this quote is important because it highlights the generational disconnect, physical distance leading to emotional distress, and loss of tradition. So, there is already a sense of abandonment, which indicates that the family is perhaps dysfunctional. It is a modern Indian family that does not care for its soul, and more importantly, the family values do not get transferred to the young generation because they are not properly cared for in the new world order. The care versus familial discourse presents to us a situation where care is piled against profit. The story also creates a clear difference in terms of the women characters we see. At the first meeting, Sita tells the Auntie May, "You are very elegant." Harold, the main male character who becomes the love interest of Auntie May and Gracie, says that he chose to marry May because she was pretty as picture but very dignified and perfect lady. Now, if we take a look at the contrast, we are introduced to Gracie as someone who jumped in the crowd to calm a cow down, and the slip of a girl in a blue sari plants herself bang in the path of a mad beast and makes this loud noise and that cowards use. So, we are reminded of an article by J. Devika where she talks about order of gender. So she says that the order of gender was projected in the 19th and early 20th century as an ideal social ordering which was maintained through clear hierarchies between gender roles. Men were posited in the external realm of the public, political, economic, and intellectual, and women were to naturally assume the role of an efficient homemaker and a true partner of the men. In order to maintain this natural binary, women's education aimed to develop a modern individual who would be able to conform to the idealized modern gendered subjectivities. And the story already sets these differences between Gracie and May, where one follows the order of gender and the other does not. Gracie is also the criminal figure. She is portrayed as mentally unstable, dangerous, and driven by intense emotions. She lives with her mother and younger brother, with no father present in her life, and this absence is significant as it adds complexity to how society views her. Grace's visibility in the public sphere raises suspicions about her sexual purity, as women who are seen too much in public often face moral scrutiny. Her lack of a father figure further intensifies these perceptions, leading us to reflect on how deeply patriarchy is ingrained in the social judgment. Now let us take a look. You know, to the next story. She closes the case, and there's a reason why I brought in Lali, and she closes the case because we will not only look at the text, we will also look at the detectives in a comparative sort of framework. So, she closes the case, which is from the Legend of Ramulamma by Vittal Rajan. Ramulamma is a midwife in rural Telangana, and she demonstrates her intelligence and insight into the complex social issues surrounding her. As a Dalit woman, she navigates a world where caste discrimination and gender biases prevail. In this particular story, Ramulamma steps into a situation where justice seems out of reach for a lower caste individual. Using her sharp mind and deep understanding of people, she successfully resolves the case and often outmaneuvering the more powerful figures like the police and the village authorities. The story reflects broader themes of caste oppression, marginalization, and the quiet strength of those at the fringes of society. Ramulama's character exemplifies how women, especially from the marginalized communities, can use their wisdom and resilience to challenge social injustices and bring about fairness. So the story begins with many onlookers visiting the house of the joint collector who has been shot to death. And Ramulama is part of the group. And we can see how the story basically begins here. So, from the very beginning, the story sets the premise of caste hierarchy, and the story goes on to tell us that Ramulamma, as befitting her lowly station in life, went round to the back of the house and, without coming close to anyone, sat on the edge of the group of village women sitting on the kitchen veranda and wailing in traditional sing song style. One is also reminded of Rudali. The story brings forward significant instances of oppression on Dalits and Dalit women, which highlight the intersectional form of oppression. The story mentions a Dalit boy who was captured and tortured by police for seeming ties with Naxalite activists. The police here is clearly corrupt. We hear about Ramulamma's niece who was killed for being a suspect of a Naxalite group, as seen in quotation number 1. We also hear very interestingly from the upper caste matriarch in the story, who is clearly casteist, who says that that girl brought death to my house, and I warned him intercaste marriages are wrong. So we can say that caste and problems with endogamy, gender, then is at the forefront of the story. Then why? Then is this story very emancipatory? Shall we call this a an intersectional story which has finally achieved what we were seeking for in the previous discussion? Uh, well, there's a twist, obviously. So Ramulamma is very different from Lali. Okay, she chances upon the incident that takes place. Now, very much unlike Lali, she does not have any professional training. She is an accidental detective who almost stumbles upon the solution to the case. She has no legacy to claim and no knowledge in scientific exploration. To make her explorations believable to the readers, she often conforms to social stereotypes, and she clearly does not fit the picture. So on the surface, we can say that the detective story, by choosing Ramulamma, a Dalit woman as its detective, challenges the conventional notion of who is a detective and what the art of detection is. The seeming destabilization of the norm becomes problematic when we see the method she chooses to resolve the issue. Now, it also raises the question that whether such reduction of so called quality is indicative of her identity as a Dalit woman. Would a Dalit man or an upper caste woman like Lali be portrayed in the same way? Would they be accidental detectives? And who can really be a detective? So, Ramulamma does not embody the true essence of Satyaneshi or truth seeker, and she lacks scientific temper. Her discoveries are also often serendipitous and not often agential. Now, I'd like to say that the agency here refers to the capacity of individuals to act intentionally and make choices that influence their lives. The agency, therefore, can be seen as the exercise of free will, and it is often associated with individualism and personal responsibility. So, Ramulama, on the other hand, like I said, is an accidental detective, and her marginalization raises questions of whether her identity as a Dalit woman limits how much autonomy and authority she is allowed within the story. I also want to draw your attention to the seeming dichotomy in the story wherein she offers a Dalit girl to the oppressive policeman to save a Dalit boy. Now, this is the conversation between the policeman and Ramulamma. So, a Dalit boy is captured by the police, and to save the boy, she actually offers a Dalit girl in exchange. Now, this raises very interesting questions. Does Ramulamma recreate gender hierarchy within the Dalit community? Unlike how she treats the upper caste girl in the story, she seems to recreate patriarchal hierarchy within her own community. Earlier, I mentioned one quotation where her niece was killed by the police. She does not protest, but she tries her best in this case to save the Dalit boy from police custody in exchange of a girl, Dalit girl. So it seems that she clearly prioritizes the male life, thereby further enhancing the marginalization of the young Dalit woman. In this way, she also reinforces the idea of sexual availability of Dalit women. The caste discourse that relies primarily on the notions of impurity and untouchability presumes such sexual availability. Therefore, when a Dalit woman goes out for work, they are often given only those kinds of work that are deemed suitable for them due to their identity as a Dalit woman. In this way, Dalit women are reinscribed in a caste sexist public space. Sharmila Rege points out that it is necessary to recognize the structural violence in terms of caste ordained linkages between sexuality and labor. So, in conclusion, what are the ways forward? How do we revise feminist praxis in a way that is more inclusive without being tokenistic? I would like to end the talk by borrowing from Sharmila Rege from her article Dalit Women Talk Differently. Rege writes, the subject of his knowledge is embodied and visible. That is, the thought begins from the lives of Dalit women, and these lives are present and visible in the results of the thought. It places emphasis on individual experiences within socially constructed groups and focuses on the hierarchical, multiple, changing structural power relations of caste, class, ethnicity, which construct such groups. It is obvious that the subject or agent of Dalit women's standpoint is multiple, heterogeneous, even contradictory. That is, that the category Dalit woman is not homogeneous. Such a recognition underlines the fact that the subject of Dalit feminist liberatory knowledge must also be the subject of every other liberatory project, and this requires a sharp focus on the processes by which gender, race, class, caste, and sexuality all construct each other. Thank you.
Hello, ma'am. Though when you were presenting your topic, I was not there. I just came. I even don't know which topic you are going to present or you have presented. But still, I am asking a question that I have understood somehow that you are talking about Dalit. So, as we know that Dalit is something that is marginalized, they are subjugated. And do you think that a women from Dalit category they are double marginalized?
Yes, this has been one of the like predominant proclamations that when we talk about Dalit women, they are marginalized, like doubly marginalized categories, because they are Dalits and they are Dalit women. So a lot of times predominant assumption continues that they're Dalit and women, but being Dalit women, like we have seen through intersectionality, presents very unique situation for them to be differently impacted. For example, in the story of Ramulama itself, we see that she kind of offers one Dalit girl in exchange for the Dalit boy to the policeman. So, which shows that there is a clear prioritization of the Dalit boy over the Dalit girl. And the way in which the policeman is also, talking about the Dalit girl, highly hypersexualized sort of figure, we can also see that, Dalit women are definitely more marginalized than Dalit women. So sometimes, yes, the doubly marginalized term can be definitely used here. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
Hello. So this is not a question. So it's just a general question that I have. Is I see that when we talk about Dalit literature, our key area of focus is often representation of the marginalized sections of the society. In this case, we're talking about women because we're also taking into question gender as such. What other nuances in representation are also key focus of, say, studies in Dalit literature, if there is any? What is the discourse like?
Okay, what is the discourse like? Okay, it's very I think we have very less time to talk about maybe the whole discourse altogether. Of course, marginality does take center stage when talking about Dalit literature. In fact, marginality is probably one of the central concerns of any resistant sort of writing altogether, be it feminist, Dalit, or Black feminist, anything at all. But Dalit writing, if I'm like going again in its earlier formulations in the 70s and all, it claimed to challenge the ways in which literature, aesthetics, the notions of writing themselves were formulated, and it challenges them. So Namdev Dhasal, for example, speaks through his anger. It's all based on so-called very realistic representation. So in such representations, Babura Bagul has this fascinating short story called Mother, where when there is a child called Pandu, he is reading the poem called Vatsalya Sindhu, but he's unable to relate to to it because his village is full of muck and mud, and his mother has to go out for work and is also subjected to sexual harassment constantly, which is not experienced by his friends in the school belonging to other castes. So Dalit writing has heavily depended on realistic representation, and it is also very much based on their experiential sort of authenticity or agency, so to say, because in that way also, as a matter of narrative framework, the question of experience becomes crucial, and it challenges the idea that there is a gap between reality and imagination, because and that's why possibly Dalit writings, Dalit women's writings have so many of autobiographies basically, where they talk about their own experiences of oppression. Yeah, so yes, yeah, please.
There was one very interesting line that you had said about how, uh, I'm not sure if this is what you said. It said something about how the literature itself, whether it acknowledges
Yeah.
or whether it takes it out or basically erodes the entire injustice or inequality as such.
Yes.
So, what would be your take?
Yeah.
on-
So I think again, when we are doing sort of maybe I can borrow from intersectionality itself, because it presents such an interesting critique of hierarchies, power structures, systems that do exist. If we can think about, or if we can present an intersectional analysis of literature or literary understanding itself. Again, literature is a very vast and varied term, so I don't even know if it's possible to reduce it to one sort of singular thing. But let's say we're talking about Savarna literature, for the lack of a better term. If we present a critique of it, then we would also pose something of like what Dorothy Smith and others do, of a criticism of disciplines. So we can think about literature itself and present a critique of it. In fact, going back to your earlier question, actually, Sharan Kumar Limbale has this fascinating book towards the Dalit aesthetic. So where he actually challenges the three ideas of Brahmanical idea of basically rasa, Satyam, Shivam, Sundaram, and he talks that we don't really have those three parameters when talking about Dalitness, because they don't really exist. So, what would be our form of art or writing or literature? So, I think it really emerges from that resistance. I think resistance would perhaps be one word which would resonate throughout their writings. Of course, it takes different forms. It has different sort of agenda, but yeah, resistance would be something I would say.
So, do you think acknowledging it is important in order to?
Yes, definitely, and also acknowledging that there is no like one blanket framework of literature. Definitely, yeah.
Also, just another thing that
Yeah,
popped
yeah.
in my head. What would you say is the space that subaltern discourse provides for, say, Dalit literature?
That's a very interesting question. Thank you for that. So, a lot of times, one argues that why don't we look at Dalit literature through the lens of subaltern studies? So, my criticism towards that perspective comes from a fact that, see, subaltern studies itself has been criticized for its elitism, inherent elitism. So, I believe that we cannot really take subaltern theory per se. Okay, we can take their methods, right? But subaltern theory it has been predominantly like used. I am not sure if it can be adequately used to analyze Dalit writing or Dalit thoughts. Of course, the subversive nature of subaltern studies is definitely, useful for Dalit writing, but I'm not sure if the theory would be applicable. Yeah.
I'm not.
Thank you.